Welcome to Modern Buddhist Practice. I'm Dr. Jared Jones, and this is another installment of the Five Foundations course on the basic cognitive skills involved in Buddhist meditation, and as far as I can tell, every system of meditation on planet Earth. Today, we're going to be talking about the second half of Foundation 4, which is the cognitive skill, the skill of being able to fully be aware of some aspect of your senses. For example, your visual, your auditory, your smell, your taste, your touch, to be fully aware of that with the minimum amount of conceptual content being added on to what you're simply being aware of. So those layers of awareness and conceptuality and so forth are things that you actually do with some training, have access to. And it's not that far outside of an ordinary person's capability to become aware of those things. And so, we need not think about it as some super weird mystical experience. If you, for example, spend some time simply becoming aware of what it is you're actually seeing before you give things names and before you start putting those names into sentences and before those sentences start becoming paragraphs, which are then stories and elaborations and then connecting memories, of course. So now you have memories and expectations about, well, I'm seeing this thing, but it's green, and the last time I saw a green thing in that shape, it was such and such and such, right? There's a huge amount of conceptual content being added on to what we're seeing, and even according to modern cognitive science, but also Buddhist, what we might call cognitive science from the past, or Buddhist epistemology, we mix the visual information with all of this conceptual information, and it gets presented to us as a visual image. So what we're seeing is not just the world. What we're seeing is the world plus memories, expectations, language, and the story that we're telling about those things. So in the first in the five external senses portion in part 1 of Foundation 4, what we did was attempt to pull back some of that, claw back some of that conceptual activity and get the mind to simply observe with the minimum amount of extra conceptual activity possible. Now, the final layer, according to Buddhism, since the five external senses are not the only senses we have, we also have the sense of consciousness. And when I say the sense of consciousness, I don't mean being aware that you're aware. What I mean is that consciousness is viewed as a sensory organ in the same way that we have five external sensory organs. Why is it viewed that way? I think it's actually worth considering, worth thinking about. From a Buddhist, not even really a Buddhist point of view, but simply sort of a reasonable point of view, a reasonable standpoint, if you use your eyes and you look at the world, you will see colors and you will see shapes, right? You can't, unless you have the ability to do, what's that called? Some people can hear shapes and textures and things, echolocation, right? So some blind people can develop or do develop very early on, their visual cortex begins to more or less take over part of their auditory processing, and so they can start to see the things they're hearing, which is really interesting. But for the most part, when all of our senses are functioning in the relatively ordinary way that they function, you only see colors and shapes with your eyes, right? So this is the unique object of your eyes, are colors and shapes, or objects of your eyes. The unique objects of your sound, of hearing, are sounds, right? Sounds in both inside your body and in the environment. The unique object of the tongue and the overall taste faculty is tastes. The unique objects of the nose and of the smelling faculty are smells. And the unique objects of tactile sensation are numerous, but there are all sorts of things that you can feel with the body. Not emotions, not feelings, but actual tactile touch, right? All sorts of things that can be touched. So the feeling of being hungry, the feeling of being thirsty, and so forth. But doesn't that leave out a huge, huge, huge part of our experience, which is when you have a thought, and as you're sitting here, maybe just think the word apple. Just say it in your mind. Did you see that with your eyes? Did you hear it with your ears? Did you touch it with... No. Did you taste it? Did you smell it? No. But some sensory faculty detected a sound that said apple. So that's consciousness. Consciousness, as a sensory organ, detects mental objects. In the same way, if you visualize an apple, right? Some of you may have difficulty with visualizations. If you just visualize something that you can visualize, I always use an apple as my example, but if there's something that you can call to mind and visualize it. In this case, a food, if you don't mind. So first, just take a moment to visualize the apple or whatever food you can bring to mind. Get it in front of you, about here, if you can. Now, in your mind, just flick the surface of it. Some of you will be able to hear the sound that was produced. And again, in your mind, lean forward and smell the visualized image. And you'll be able to smell, some of you, the apple or whatever food it is you visualized. And if you take a bite, you'll be able to taste the apple that you visualized. So the mind is capable of generating these images that are not experienced by the other senses, and as a matter of fact, are not experienced in general terms by any other person on the planet. So that you have a completely private world of images, or a mostly private world of images. For those of you who think clairvoyance is probably a thing, and some people can probably become aware of your mental contents, according to Buddhism, that is a possibility. If you train your mind, that you can gain clairvoyance. I never used to believe in this, but I've had a few experiences now with some of my teachers and some other people that I know that convinced me that this may actually be a real thing. But that's a story for another day. In any case, let's just say that for now that your mental contents are completely private. The mental images are very strange. They're very, very strange. The apple you visualized, unlike an apple in the real world, didn't have to grow on a tree. You can't go to any orchard anywhere on earth where you could find that apple, where you could find apples of that kind growing, because that apple didn't grow. There's no instrument on earth that can measure that apple. There are instruments on earth that can do all sorts of measurements of your brain, but the image itself that you're looking at, that is, let's say, red with a little brown stem and a green leaf that makes a sound when you flick it, that you can taste, that you can smell, that when you touch it, it feels tactile and firm. That apple can't be found anywhere and measured by any instrument. And unless you believe in clairvoyance and you think that's a real thing, no one else in the entire universe can observe this object. That's very strange, because there's no other physical thing on earth that's like that. All physical things can, in principle, through measurement devices or whatever, be observed by another person. But in the case of an apple, visualized in your mind, It's completely private, has no causal chain in terms of physical events. The other quite strange thing to think of is, what is that image made of? What is it made out of? Because if it was made out of conventional atoms, then those atoms would each have a causal history going at least to the Big Bang. But whatever it's made out of seems to sort of materialize briefly for you, and then when you stop thinking about it, it disappears. This is very, very, very strange. So, how much stranger is the thing that's looking at it? So the mind, also, according to Buddhism, just like these strange mental images, is quite strange in physicalist terms, in materialist terms. The mind is very strange. So the mind does not have a color. It doesn't have a shape. And although there is a center of awareness, in other words, you sort of place your awareness in one location, awareness, according to Buddhism, is not actually limited to one location. It's formless. It can spread out over a large area. So this that would then explain, well, how is it that a person could know something that's happening in a far distant place according to Buddhist psychology? Well, because consciousness is non-physical, it spreads out, or it is capable at least of spreading out over a large area. And since it's non-local, since it's not limited to one location, it can know things that are occurring in other locations. It can do things in other locations, in fact, which then, of course, carries on, and through various capabilities, you're then able to explain things like, potentially, what would seem like a miracle, right? But again, from a Buddhist standpoint, it's not really a miracle. It's just, a person that's developed capabilities, or a being that's developed capabilities that you don't currently possess, right? It's all causal. It's all due to causal chains in reality. But to reel it back from what may sound much more like a religious discussion for many of you, we've just had a little experiment where you visualize something in your mind. It seems very, I don't want to say real, right, in the same sense as this stuff, because it's not a physical object, but it's something that has a wide range of tactile, smell, taste, blah, 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 sensory kinds of qualities, but it's not being detected by the external five senses. It's being detected by consciousness. And Buddhism says this consciousness thing over here is its own sensory power. Okay? So consciousness is its own sensory power, in the same way that you have eyes that see and ears that hear. Consciousness knows mental objects. And with training, according to Buddhism, consciousness can also know all sorts of other things that aren't accessible locally. So this is then part of the explanation for those who are interested for how it is that great meditators who have tremendous control over their consciousness are able to do miracles and exercise clairvoyance and recall past lives, which then, of course, speaks to some of the authority-building systems in Buddhism as a religious practice, right? So, of course, that's not the only means of building authority, but one type of authority is to say, well, a person who is an expert knows something that I don't know. And in this arena, there are meditators who are fantastic meditators who have capabilities that I don't have, and therefore know certain things about how the universe works, or certain things about rebirth, or certain things about karma that I don't personally know myself. And some of you may be thinking, but doesn't that violate the Kalama Sutta? The Kalama Sutta from the Pali Canon, and long discussion, but no, it doesn't. The Kalama clan they were not the Buddha's students, and if you read that sutta, at the end, all of them convert to Buddhism. So the idea that the Kalama Sutta is a sort of radical free inquiry sort of thing doesn't hold water. The Kalama clan were looking to the Buddha to help them figure out how it is to pick a teacher if you haven't trained in one tradition for a long time already. How do you choose a teacher? And he rejects a whole bunch of things that when you think about each one of them, and again, we could have a long discussion on this, but when you think about each one of them, significant portions of them at least are things that if you just sort of took everyone's word for it religiously, you could never make a decision. For example, tradition. Well, everyone has traditions. So if I'm going by the fact that people have a tradition, I can't make a decision. Well, Holy Scripture. Well, everyone has Holy Scripture. So if I'm just going by the fact that we have Holy Scripture, and they have Holy Scripture, and those people over there have Holy Scripture, well, now I can't make a decision. The Buddha also rejects two classifications of reasoning that were, at least in my understanding, were the sort of two major schools of logical debate and discussion at the time, coming from the Vedic schools, that he says, well, you can't trust that either, which really confounds some of the arguments that people would like to make in terms of like a radical free inquiry sutta. I hope I'm not boring anyone here, but yeah, he also rejects speculative reasoning, for example, where he says, well, these people might speculate that you need a creator God. These people might speculate you don't need a creator God. But if all we're going on is the reasonable speculations of philosophers, for example, we can't make a decision just based upon, well, isn't it reasonable to speculate X? Because both are equally unfounded reasonable speculations. You see? So then he says, well, what can you rely on? The Buddha says, what can you rely on? He said, well, what you can do is assess the truthfulness of the portion of the teaching being given to you that is accessible to your experience. That's the portion that you can truly assess without having to dive for decades and decades into all of the primary materials and so forth of these traditions, is my way of interpreting this. And he said, through assessing that portion that's accessible to your experience, you can then make a decision on a teacher and therefore then follow one teacher for an extended period of time, which is ultimately what the Kalama clan decides to do. They become Buddhist. So what is the exercise that he gives them at that time? He says, well, isn't it true that a person who has hatred in their mind has such and such and such results here and now that are available or that are obvious to everyone? And they say, well, yeah, he says, that's true. And the Buddha says, well, that's my teaching. My teaching is that hatred has all of these negative effects. So now you verified this part of my teaching. He says, well, isn't it true that such and such and such? And so he does a bunch of these. And then the Kalama clan says, this is the most convincing argument that we've heard, so we're going to become Buddhists. So Buddhism, in the end, does not reject what we might call faith in authority. There are all sorts of teachings in Buddhism where they say you need to have some faith in people that know more stuff than you, which should be obvious to anyone who's got a head on their shoulders, I hope. Okay, so to circle back around, I'm giving you this philosophical exercise. You can find, by the way, this exercise we just went through with the apple, you can find a similar exercise there's a dialogue between Venerable Atisha, who is sort of one of the great scholars and practitioners of the Nalanda monastery tradition, that was invited to come to Tibet and help bring the Buddhist teachings to Tibet. There's a dialogue between Atisha and one of his primary Tibetan students, Gampopa. Oh, no, not Gampopa. What's his name? I'm forgetting his name, but those of you who have been around, you'll know his name. And they have this same discussion. But this is a classic analysis in Western philosophy as well. Just look at how strange mental images are. You know, you can see this apple, you can smell it, you can taste it, you can touch it, and yet it doesn't operate under the same rules as the rest of the universe at all, as far as we can tell. And I have a document with, I don't know, 300 pages or something, where I've gone through all of the major arguments that say consciousness has to be physical. For those of you who are interested, I can give that to you. But in brief, Buddhism says consciousness just does not make sense for consciousness to be physical. Doesn't mean consciousness doesn't have a relationship with the physical. As a matter of fact, in Buddhist Tantra, they say that the subtlest or most reductive unit of reality is not simply atoms, that atoms are a very coarse physical manifestation of physical stuff, but the subtlest unit of reality is actually an inseparability of clear light, or the subtlest type of consciousness, and a very subtle type of physical matter that's very, very much more subtle than protons and electrons and these sorts of things. So by the time you get up to our level of experience, most of consciousness is nothing like physical matter. It's very strange. It seems to have seems to operate on totally different rules and principles than physical matter. In the same way that the apple you visualized operates on very different principles than physical matter. But when you get down to the subtlest unit of consciousness, it is an inseparability with the subtlest type of matter and the subtlest type of consciousness. So that's the sort of what for the philosophers in the room, it's a neutral monism. It's not a dualism of consciousness stuff and matter stuff that can never talk, like Kantian dualism. It's a neutral monism in which matter and consciousness are always together at the subtlest level, and neither one is primary. That's why it's neutral. Neither one is sort of the dominant force that creates the other one or whatever. They're both always together, which, by the way, helps explain karma. If the subtlest unit of reality is a combination of mental and physical stuff, this helps explain why it is that stuff going on with consciousness as we get up to coarser and coarser levels of experience can and should have an effect on physical reality. Right, okay, so we've gone from 5 foundations to outer space. Hopefully this has been entertaining and worth watching. But the point that we're actually discussing today is consciousness. And since we've made it this far, I really wanted to give you a sense that there's something unique, special, important about consciousness itself. So just to briefly review, there are 5 external senses according to Buddhism. And then there's one internal sense that is consciousness itself. Consciousness itself has unique objects like the visualized apple, like thought, like memory. Again, this is not to say that there aren't certain physical things that are very much like memory. There's a lot of research on that, and there's Buddhist stuff like that too. When you get into the Buddhist tantras, there's all sorts of descriptions of the way that stuff sort of, and the energy of various actions and so forth gets stuck inside the body. And again, not the purpose of this course. So consciousness is its own sense, and consciousness is quite strange, actually, in the same way that the visualized image of an apple is quite strange, in that it is clear, meaning that it has no color or shape, and that it is not actually simply a local thing. Yes, it has a relationship with the brain, but it's not the brain. It's something different than physical matter, in the same way that the visualized apple is not composed of atoms, right? The visualized apple is not composed of atoms. I am not saying that if we put you in in an MRI, that there wouldn't be some sort of pattern in your neurons that we could then turn into an image on a screen of an apple, right? We've done that kind of research. But the image of the screen on the apple is made of atoms. It's made of particles. The image in your head is not made of particles. And if it was, we'd be able to measure those particles making up this apple here with some kind of device. But there's no device on the planet that I'm aware of, and I've looked, that can measure the actual stuff that you're using to create these images. So in the same way, the mind that is creating those images is not something that can be measured with instruments. It is not a physical thing, according to Buddhism. And I'm trying to give you like an actual argument for this instead of just saying, well, Buddha said so. So hopefully that'll be helpful. Right. So now that we've come that far, let me say this. Having all of that information is maybe has some benefits going down the road in terms of your view to help support the practice. But in terms of the sort of day-by-day practice itself, you don't have to take that view on in order to do the practice. You can do these practices holding whatever views you hold, but in my humble opinion and some of my teachers, these views, if you take them on and you take them seriously, really do help with the training. Okay? Okay, so now we're going to be talking about the second part of Foundation 4. The first part was the 5 external senses, and now we're going to talk about the 6th, consciousness. So, pardon me, recovering from a cold. Without any further ado, at 30 minutes in, here we go. Foundation 4, Part 2, the mental sense gate. So, begin with 5-minute intensive breath meditation. So that's Foundation 1, a body scan. We've also covered that, or other practices that calm your mind. For those of you who have done some Tibetan tantric practice, the 9 rounds of breathing can be helpful. For those of you who have done Taoist practice, there are a whole host of energetic practices you could do. Whatever practices make your mind very calm will benefit this tremendously. Okay? So what is the actual practice here? In the same way that you did with Foundation 4, for example, with regards to vision. With regards to vision, you opened up the visual field with each eye individually, and then you opened up the visual field with both eyes. Yes? It didn't matter what was appearing before your eyes, did not matter whatsoever. The only thing that mattered was that you were getting in touch for the first time, probably for the first time, with your ability to simply see whatever occurred in any part of the visual field simultaneously. Yes? So using now the mind as an analogy, or using the visual sense as an analogy, we're now going to do the same thing with the mind, right? So we were visualizing an apple. We were visualizing the apple a moment ago, or whatever food, and the mind was sort of over here, let's say, observing the apple. This making sense? So the mind is now capable, from that little experiment, you can see the mind is capable of just sort of observing a mental object. So in this case, when you were doing vision, you weren't trying to make anything in particular appear in front of your vision, right? You're not like painting a painting or something. You're not trying to create a certain visual image. You're just sort of sitting back, opening the visual field and letting whatever occurs in the visual field occur. Here, you're going to learn how to step back and simply let whatever mental images, thoughts, words, phrases, memories, emotions, and so forth come through the mind, whatever comes through the mind, you just step back and take the stance that you're watching them from a distance. One analogy that can be quite helpful is it's a bit like watching TV or sitting in a theater watching a play, or going to the movie theater and watching something on a really big screen. So you want the feeling that your mind is sort of over here, and what you're seeing is sort of over there. So all the content is now over here, and the thing looking at all the content is now over here. So you're going to separate these two. Much, much easier said than done. So, critical. Absolutely anything that appears in your mind is the object of concentration to begin with. So, if a mental image appears, if the apple appears, if a thought appears, a word, a phrase, a memory, doesn't matter what it is, you simply observe as if you're watching the movie in your mind happen, as if you're watching the play happen in your mind. All right? If there's a gap where you're sitting and you're observing the mental contents and then nothing occurs, then simply sit in the gap. So we discussed before about when you close your eyes, you see black. And this is really critical. So I'll describe it again. For people that have no visual experience at all, they don't see black at all. There's simply nothing there. In the same way that pigeons have magnetoperception and sharks have electroperception, when they encounter magnetism or electrical fields, there is a sensory experience for them that we don't have at all. So when we experience a magnet, or we experience the pull of the earth, or these sorts of things, there's no sensory experience of those at all, besides, maybe in the case of gravity, let's say we're being pulled to the earth, so we feel the pull of gravity. But for magnets, generally speaking, there's nothing. And for electroperception, electrical fields, generally speaking, there's nothing, unless you're talking about, getting shocked by an electrical shock. So when someone has no visual experience, they don't even see black. When you close your eyes, you see black. There is a visual experience of black, or dark, or gray, right? So in the same way, when there's no mental content, you're having an experience of a lack of mental content. And so the key word here is perhaps awareness, right? You rest in pure awareness in those cases. You don't try to make something appear. You don't analyze, oh, well, yes, this is this and this is that, and oh, look at this part, and yes, there's bliss now, and blah, blah. You don't do any of that. So this then piggybacks directly onto the next portion. So when do you know that you have lost the object of focus? If the object of focus is a continuous flow of different events. So you've lost the object of focus. Let's say that, to use a visual analogy, let's say that the object of awareness is the entire visual field. If you see someone walking in your visual field and you go bang, and you look at that person, and everything else becomes a little gray, a little hazy, you've lost the object of focus. Because the object of focus wasn't one person walking. The object of focus was the entire visual field. Yes? So, if the object of focus is the entire mental field, and you zoom into one thought, And through zooming in on that thought, you lose the flow of other information occurring in the mind. You've lost the objective focus. In particular, just like with the other sense gates, let's say you zoom in on the thought of the apple, and you go, oh, the apple. I remember that example. That elaboration, where you elaborated and your mind went, oh, I remember the example of the apple, and you added that commentary with deliberate intent, even though it happens in a fraction of a second, you lost the object of meditation because you elaborated on the original thought. So, in the same way, if you analyze something, if you add something, if you identify with something, in other words, you're sitting there and you think, maybe you have an image in your mind of how somebody looked at you earlier, and you go, oh God, they looked at me, blah, 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 right? I can't believe they did that, and last week they, whatever. That first initial moment where you went, me, you lost the object. My experience of being looked at in a way I don't like. As soon as you identify with it and you make it you, you've lost the object of meditation. So when you're sitting there, again, it's almost like watching a movie. You're simply aware of all the content. The memory of someone looking at your body, because they can't see your mind, they look at your body and they make a certain face. By the way, you have no idea what that face means, or if it's even related to you. In most circumstances. So this person makes this face, and it's like watching it on television. There's the person, they're making the face, this image popped up for some reason. I can't stop it from popping up, so there it is. And there it goes. Okay, now here's the apple again, and now the apple goes. And now here's a random thing that looks like a candlestick, and there it goes. And now there's nothing. And now there's a half-formed thought that doesn't become a full thought. Blah, 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 right? So you're just continuously aware of the movie of the content of your mind. Does this make sense? And if you get drawn in and you start elaborating and thinking and doing stuff with whatever has occurred, you've lost the object. If you start analyzing it and trying to figure something out, you've lost it. If you identify with some aspect of the movie and make it about you, you've lost the object. So the reason, hopefully you can see now, that I have left this for last in this sort of long process we've been through is that it's hard. We're now working with the very thing itself that makes reality what it is. At least half, if not more, of your entire experience of everything, including yourself, it comes here. Or Japanese, Chinese, Tibetans might say here, comes from your mind. So to use the very thing that's making reality as it is, to investigate itself, is not easy. So that's why I've left it for here. So what do you do? Once this sense gate is open and once you're not getting caught up in all the contents and you're not elaborating and all that, what do? You simply rest with the mind in that condition. So you simply hold the mind in the same way that you held the visual field open, you held the auditory field open, you held the tactile field open. Now you just hold the mental field open and you observe. You don't try to figure anything out. You don't try to you don't elaborate on anything. You don't identify with anything. You simply hold it open and observe mental content. Okay, do Nothing else. That is all. So the next exercise that you can do once the sixth sense is more open, and then not in some woo-woo way, but in the way I just described. In other words, you can separate the content from the observer, and you can simply observe the content. Once you can do that, once you can separate these two, then you can combine all six together as one exercise. What does that mean? Well, what it means is that you can hold the visual field open, the auditory field open, the smell open, the taste open, touch open, and the mind open. You can hold all six doors open without getting pulled into any part of any one door. And if that sounds impossible, it's only because you're still very much caught up in the process of getting pulled in to various parts of your awareness. You don't yet have the ability to simply pull back and rest in an open state of awareness where you don't get pulled into particular parts of your experience. If you had the ability with vision to not get pulled into some part of the experience, it would make sense that, well, yeah, now I just need to open the body and not get pulled into that either. And if I could do that, then I'm just holding two parts of my awareness open, and I'm not focusing in particular on any one part of them. I'm just holding them open and being aware of the whole thing, right? It's only because you have this habit of going bang, 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 and zooming in to various parts and then elaborating furiously on that part, and then bang, zooming in on another part and elaborating furiously over here. It's only because of that habit that you think, oh, this is impossible. The hardest part of this is going to be adding consciousness. This is, again, why I've put it at the end of this section. Adding the consciousness element is the hardest because it's constantly elaborating, constantly adding stuff. It's very difficult. It's very difficult to do. I don't need to say too much about this because the next section is basically all about that practice. So once you have some experience opening the consciousness gate and getting a separation between the contents and the thing that is observing and generating the contents of experience, right? As soon as once you have some experience making the mind like a mirror or an observer, simply observing what's occurring as stuff is going over here, right? The mind is not zooming in and getting stuck on what's occurring. It just observes, and the contents carry on doing what they're doing. Eventually, the contents become less, and they become more smooth and more fluid and less disturbing. And if you ask the great masters, eventually the contents just stop. And that doesn't mean your personality stops. And this sounds quite strange, but even in a state where the mental content of that and commentary of that kind has ceased, as far as you can tell, you still continue to, according to the great swordsman, for example, you still continue to wield your sword with great effect. In fact, if you'd like to be of the greatest class of Japanese swordsmen, according to people like Takuan Soho, for example, and Miyamoto Musashi, you must have this kind of mind. You must have this diamond-like focus that doesn't get caught up in what's occurring, either internally or externally, for those who are interested. Right, so advanced practice. Some of you will say, I went and I learned this practice of just sitting on day one when I went and I did Zen. Some of you might say, oh, we did something like this when I did Thai forest tradition. Some of you might say in the Tibetan tradition, we started with this right away, and this is like what beginners do. And all of those points are fair enough. There are enough references here and there to say that something like a just sitting practice is beneficial for beginners. So let me justify and explain why I have put it here more towards the end of my sort of training of these really rigorous meditative cognitive skills. I've been moderating Buddhist forums online for about 10 years, and currently I'm moderating Buddhist forums on Facebook in particular that have about, I think, somewhere in the ballpark of 900,000 members. And prior to moderating, I was a member of a number of Buddhist groups online for, I don't know, at least another 5 years or something like this. I've also been teaching now, I think, for 3 or 4 years. And here's what I have to say about the sort of general state of capability, in particular among city-dwelling lay people who have, for whatever reason, found these kinds of techniques first. It's my opinion that this particular technique requires one of two things. It requires a huge amount of setup so that your mind is already in a really good starting position, so that you don't have to do such long sessions. Or it requires that you do long sessions. Why? If this cup had dirty water in it, right? If this cup had dirty water in it, and all day long I was going like this, and then for 5 minutes a day, I let it sit still, and then I woke up the next morning and got back to swirling it, and then 5 minutes I let it rest, and then I got right back to swirling it, and then maybe 20 minutes I let it rest, and then I got right back to swirling it, and then an hour I let it rest, and then right back to swirling it. Is the dust and dirt and mud ever going to settle to the bottom? I think that's a questionable proposition. And when you look at what the great masters say about this particular technique of just sitting, it works because you just sit. You do nothing else, and just like muddy water, all of the dirt and dust and so forth eventually settles to the bottom and completely clarifies the liquid, and nothing else has to be done. It's brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. Incredibly profound. And it is perhaps the most, as far as I can see, at least among the most pervasively taught meditative techniques in world religions in general, in the Asian traditions, the Indian traditions, and so forth. Incredibly profound. But if you have 10 or 15 minutes a day, and the rest of the day you're going like this, and then you have 10 minutes and you do it again, or 20 minutes or 30 minutes, and then you're back to this, how the hell are you going to settle all the dirt out of here and make it clear? How? You're not. You're just not. Except for a few people maybe who have jobs where you have to concentrate really hard all day, and you have to, maybe you have a physical job where you have to really be focused fully in the moment in what you're doing all day long. And then, right, so you're not doing too much stirring during the day. There's a bit of stirring, not much. And then you come home 30 minutes, right? And then you go back to work for like 10 hours, a little bit of movement, then you come home, right? Okay, maybe that works. And this is why the Japanese, in particular, I think, have so many discipline arts, where martial arts, tea ceremony, calligraphy, flower arranging, gardening, basically you name it, they have taken some art form or some craft or some martial technique and added on a system where more and more of your day, you're making the mind rest still in the midst of activity. So the activity is going on, but the mind is not moving as much, right? They've invented crafts like this so that your mind can stay more still, and then when you do your stillness practice, bang, right? Then when you do your just sitting, maybe you only have 30 minutes or an hour a day, but most of your day was spent cultivating this stillness quality, which means the mind's going to get more and more clear over time. Very profound techniques. However, for most people living modern lives, running around, raising the kids, working in a job that's not designed to make your mind calm, living in an environment where you're going to be probably unwinding by scrolling through social media or watching television, this kind of technique, where you just sit and then you stir the rest of the day, I think is going to be very difficult, very problematic for most people. All right, so this is my humble view, humble opinion on this issue. So why do I put it at this stage of the process and not earlier? I put it at this stage of the process and not earlier because with the techniques I've already given you, you can now take what you're doing, hopefully, and use all these other skills to make your life more like the Japanese craftsman arts, where your life is going on and carrying on and quite complex and whatever, but your mind is increasingly still. Now, when you come to this technique of let's just sit with the mind has already started to settle. You see? So that's why I've put it here in the process and not earlier. And for those teachers who say, no, you can do this right away, you're probably right. But remember, the idea with this course is to help modern city-dwelling lay people in the largest numbers possible be able to make progress quickly, easily, consistently, and to gain experience in the most basic, not the most basic, but the sort of full range of cognitive capabilities that you gain as a meditator. Okay? So that is my sort of, hopefully not too long TED Talk on why I've put it here rather than earlier, and hopefully that convinces you that, if your life is totally nuts and you don't have these other capabilities, that you don't want to spend too much time on this technique. You want to do these other techniques that are really effective at making your mind more calm and getting more and more of your life stable, right? So maybe your life is not as stable, but the mind is getting more stable in the midst of life. It's not stirring as much. All right. Hopefully this will come back. Okay, good. So now, just sitting. Just sitting is a direct translation of shikantaza, which is Soto Zen Buddhist main practice. And in my opinion, there are differing opinions, but in my opinion, it was heavily influenced by Taoist practice, in particular the Taoist practice of sitting and forgetting, zuowang, right? And I apologize for anyone who speaks any form of Chinese because I definitely do not have the intonations correct. This technique is also found in Tibetan Mahamudra, and from what I can tell, in Tibetan Dzogchen, though I have not been formally trained in Tibetan Dzogchen, for the record. I have received significant training in Tibetan Mahamudra, but not Dzogchen. But from what I can tell, these practices rely upon the same principle, very similar principle. Also, just as a side note, I have it down here, the modern Hindu practitioner Sadhguru, who's quite popular, also uses this technique with his students. So this is just an extremely pervasive technique. You find it all over the place. And I think the reason you find it all over the place is because it's profound and it works. Most of the schools, though, that tell you this technique is incredibly profound and it works and you should do it, tell you that you should be doing it in like 3 or 4 hour sessions every time. But if you can, you want to do like a minimum of 12 hours a day. Why? Because you need the mind to be completely calm and made calm through simply sitting and resting and doing nothing for long periods so the dirt can settle out by itself. You're not going to do that in 20 minutes. Now, how do you get around that? I'm not sure you can fully get around it. You're going to need to probably sit for at least an hour at a time, maybe an hour and a half. But what you can do is, as I said before, if this is your life right now, where you're constantly stirring, it's constant chaos, what I'm trying to do is give you a foundation where your life is a little more stable. There's still some vibration, right? But you've now stabilized the mind enough so that when you decide you're going to just sit, you're starting from a place that's more calm. So instead of starting from this insane chaos, you're starting from a place where the movement is less. And therefore, you can get to a more settled state within a shorter period of time. And therefore, I think this technique will show some fruit. In brief, this class of meditative techniques involves long seated sessions, physical stillness, and allowing or letting thoughts, feelings, and self-identity dissolve via simply resting in choiceless or intentionless awareness. The mind becomes lucid and stable by simply opening the 6 sense gates and doing nothing else whatsoever. Doing nothing else whatsoever. The key point is to sit still. If you read Dogen's works, he goes so far as to say that posture is enlightenment. Let me say it again. Dogen goes so far as to say posture is enlightenment. One of my own teachers, Kimura Sensei, whose lineage is just unbelievable, the great Okinawan masters of the last 200 years are all, at least half of the great big names that everyone would know are in his lineage. I can give that to some people. If upon request, I can give them that lineage. So Kimura Sensei taught Kimball Whitfield, who taught me, and one of his famous quotes is, standing up straight is enlightenment. So the key point is to sit still. That doesn't mean sit rigidly. Right? You need to be in a comfortable posture, because if you're going to sit for 4 hours, you can't sit like this. You won't last 30 minutes that way. The spine does need to be straight, but other than that, sit wherever it's comfortable to sit. Sit on your bed, sit on your couch, have a big stack of pillows and things for your knees and whatever in your shrine room. Does not matter one iota. Just find a position where your spine is straight and sit completely still. Now, while you're sitting completely still, what are you doing? You're letting go of intent. You're letting go of... Sorry, that's my dog over there, if you've heard that. Scaring himself half to death. You're letting go of making a choice. You're letting go of deliberately doing anything. Again, I put this last because this is really, really hard. I think for most people, this is probably impossible or nearly impossible. Unless you're sitting for 10 or 12 hours a day, you're not just going to figure this out by just sitting still for 30 minutes, right? This is why I helped you open each of the 6 sense gates individually, because you'll have some sense of what it means to simply rest in awareness of what's occurring without making a choice, without doing anything deliberately. You're simply opening and resting, holding. Yes? Since you can do that with each of the 6 sense gates individually, again, for my purposes, for this course, I would say that's a prerequisite. You want to be able to open each sense gate individually. If you can do that, then probably in 30 minutes, 60 minutes, 90 minutes, you can actually do shikantaza and have it be meaningful. So that's why I have, again, put it in this order. Now, this next part does not come from any canonical source, let's say. This is just my way of breaking this down to make it easier to understand, okay? It may be more accurate to say it doesn't come from a single canonical source. These are real things. They're described in various places, but no one, insofar as I know, has laid them out in exactly this way. But the flow is logical, and I hope it will make sense, okay? So what are the types of just sitting practice? In my humble way of breaking this down, there are 3, okay? The easiest, which is not easy, is to open all 6 sense gates and to simply sit. That is the easiest, which is not easy. And that's the one that you can take out into the wild, let's say. You can take it out off the cushion into your real life. You can use it when you're at work. You can use it when you're having an argument with your spouse. You can use it when you're having a nice meal at a restaurant. You can use this level of just sitting all the time. This is your everyday just sitting, your all day just sitting, okay? This is how you take, ultimately, one of the most profound, maybe the most profound technique for taking a lifetime of practice of training the mind and baking it in to your normal everyday activities. If you can do this, you can transform, I think, anything, or maybe just about anything that you're already doing, as long as it's not too unethical, and you can transform it into some type of mind training through this. So very important, the easy just sitting practice. If you're doing it as a formal session and you're sitting down, I would say you could do 30 minutes if you want to build up the habit, but you're probably going to start seeing the most benefits at about an hour or over an hour. You may want to aim for 4 hours, 3 to 4 hours, if you want to get maximum benefits from this practice in a single session, by the way, not multiple sessions. If you need to sort of slightly reduce the amount of concentration and move your legs into different positions while you're doing, if you were going to do 3 or 4 hours, that's fine. Again, the key is this technique works because you stop swirling and you just let it settle. The longer you let it settle, the more benefit you get. Okay? And this is assuming that you can actually sit there with the 6 sense gates open, or at least you're struggling to keep them open. Because if you stop struggling to keep them open, then you're just sitting there elaborating on your own thoughts, which is not any kind of training, right? So you need to know yourself, and you need to know yourself, and you need to work on awareness, right? If you stop the process of awareness and you stop the process of struggling to remain in a state of pure awareness, then you're not doing this training anymore. You're just sitting there thinking stuff through. And that's not just sitting practice. That's something else. All right? So if you need to adjust the body a little bit as you build this practice up, for those of you who want to go hardcore with this practice, if you're building up to 3 or 4 hours of sitting, it's okay for the body to move a little bit at first. I do have a little note about this. Maybe the first year or so, you might have to sort of do this sort of thing, you know? or you're shifting around and whatever. And then the next year, maybe your movements will be like this. They'll just be these little, little adjustments here and there. And then eventually you're sitting there and no one can tell you're moving, but inside, I mean, you probably can't see it, but inside you're making little adjustments that can't be seen from the outside because there's discomfort building up somewhere. And then eventually you don't adjust anything at all. And you're just sitting. And the level of discomfort that builds up is not too much. It's not too much for you to handle, so you handle it and you carry on and you do your session. Okay? So, yes. Let me back up for just a moment and talk about this footnote. So, doing nothing, doing non-doing, the intention of no intention, the choice of choicelessness, all of this kind of language refers to a state of mind in which there's no goal, no target, no attainment that you have in mind that is related to I and mine. So my heart teacher, Kimball Whitfield, referred to this, borrowing from the Zen tradition, as mushotoku. It's a Japanese word. It literally translates as no goal, but he translated it a little bit more in terms of its core meaning, which is the intent of no intent. So what does that mean? It means that you have generated a state of mind where you don't have a target. You're not looking to gain something. You're not looking to profit something. You're not looking to attain something. And it's the attainment of no attainment, right? When you can do this, you have gained an attainment. But it's an attainment of not having gained some kind of attainment related to I and mine. The other thing is you've gained the ordinary condition. What do I mean by ordinary? What I mean by ordinary is pure awareness is ordinary. For those of you who have been around and met great masters, what's almost always said of great masters is that they seem so ordinary. They seem so understated. They seem so, you expect them to be floating off the ground and to be full of some kind of really obvious bliss and whatever. And quite often, they just seem like extremely ordinary people, in the sense not that they're doing all sorts of unethical things, but in the sense that they are sort of meek. But not meek in terms of non-action, not meek in terms of not having a force of personality, because quite often they have an extreme force of personality, but ordinary and meek in the sense of they don't seem like they're doing anything special. They don't seem like there's something special happening. And that's part of what makes them so extraordinary, is there's this sense of sort of ordinary ease that's going on all the time. So, with years of training and effort, one no longer, one first has sort of stretches of pure, effortless presence, where you have simply arrived in the present moment, and there is very little or no sense of the ordinary I and mind that would be present involved in your activities, because you have stripped away much of the conceptual and emotional support for that gets in the way of simply having pure awareness. And this is not the end of the process, but this is an extremely important capability in the process of training the mind in a Buddhist sense. And the type of I and mind that we're getting out of the way requires a lot of discussion, so I'll save that maybe for Foundation 5. Yeah. So this kind of mental capability, this kind of mental state is an extremely effective support for training in Buddhist Tantra for those who are interested or already doing those kinds of practices. And also really are tremendous benefit in the process of training in selflessness or emptiness. So if you are interested in that kind of practice, if you want to understand Buddhist emptiness and Buddhist selflessness, which are quite a bit different than what emptiness means, for example, very often in a Taoist context, and in some Kagyu contexts is quite similar. Being able to get much of your ordinary sense of self out of the way allows you to then, and to be aware of what's occurring from moment to moment, and being able to generate whatever it is you'd like to generate in your mind at any given time. All of these skills incredibly important and beneficial for bringing the practice of selflessness to full fruition. Okay, just a little side note there. So this easy one, level 1, just opening 6 sense gates, again, not really easy, but easy relative to the other 2 levels, is something that you can bring into almost any activity, and is a tremendous supplement and benefit and foundation for all sorts of other things. So if you can do this and gain this capability and maintain it, then virtually your entire life becomes a process of training the mind towards virtuous qualities, which is I think worth doing, to put it mildly. So what is level 2? So when you look at, for example, the Tibetan Mahamudra commentaries on Tilopa, like the Panchen Lama Choki Gyaltsen's commentary on Tilopa's Mahamudra text, which is a classic in the Gelug tradition. What's described there is that once the sense gates are open, eventually you turn your attention towards the mind only. Okay? So you turn the attention towards consciousness, and once you find a gap between thoughts and elaborations, right? I'm sorry, not between thoughts and elaborations, but in your mind there are thoughts, there are elaborations, there are emotions, there are images, there are memories. So this constantly churning process is going on, but at some point there's a gap. There's a gap where there's a churning stuff happening here, and then there's nothing happening, and then there's churning again. So in the beginning, you learn how to identify this gap. And through the mind settling over time, those gaps get bigger, and you can hold them open for longer periods of time. Now, once those gaps get big enough, you can hold them open for a period of time, then you sort of hold the mind's awareness in those, you do hold the mind's awareness in those gaps. And through holding the mind's awareness in those gaps, eventually you gain a direct experience of consciousness itself. So once you gain a direct experience of consciousness itself as pure awareness, with sufficient practice, and to be honest, I haven't done sufficient practice in this area to have very much experiential ability to comment on it experientially, but I'll give you a bit of commentary on it nonetheless from the other things that I have studied and what my teachers have said. Once you have gained the ability to close the 5 external senses and open this, no, sorry, I don't want to mix my terminology. Once you have gained the ability to find the gap between thoughts, then eventually you'll gain the ability to simply be aware of consciousness independent of the 5 external senses, and the 5 external senses close completely, they turn off. You can make the 5 external senses turn off using a whole bunch of different methods. Basically, if you concentrate on anything that is not the 5 external senses, and you focus with a sufficient intensity on that thing, then the 5 external senses close. So having the 5 senses turn off is not unique to this technique, but we are specifically here looking at the gap between 2 thoughts, emotions, memories, whatever, and slowly over time through training, expanding that gap and becoming aware of what consciousness itself is. Once you have an experience of pure consciousness, then you can begin to do other types of training related to consciousness. And those types of training are very much related to rumination meditation, which is Foundation 5. And then through these rumination meditations, which at that level would be non-conceptual rather than conceptual, or would be at least mostly non-conceptual, you can gain the deepest realizations of Buddhist practice. All right. So then level 3. So in my humble view, both highest yoga tantra in the Tibetan tradition and Taoist Neidan, at least in the school that I have studied, they are aimed at, through various techniques, generating what in the Gelug tradition of Tibetan Buddhism they call clear light, or clear light mind, or clear light awareness, or bliss emptiness, or bliss awareness. There are all sorts of different terms, but the most important bit is that through various techniques you're able to generate the absolute most subtle state of consciousness that exists. So this is, to make an analogy, earlier I was talking about how there's physical stuff, and then according to Buddhism there are physical substances that are subtler than atoms, and the subtlest state of consciousness is inseparable with that subtlest physical substance, right? So the very subtlest state of consciousness isn't just like a hypothetical speculative thing that Buddhists came up with to solve problems in their philosophy. It's an experience. You can experience this subtlest state of consciousness, which is clear light. Okay? This clear light awareness is also, in my understanding, what they call Rigpa in the Nyingma tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, which is, again, Dzogchen, which I have not trained in formally. So there's some debate, and some say Rigpa is different than clear light and blah, 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 but the people that I've studied with and trained with and so forth, and actually I think a fair number of Nyingma practitioners who are of quite a high level say, no, these are the same thing. So what is clear light? Clear light is the very subtlest state of consciousness. It's much more subtle than, for example, finding a gap between your thoughts, turning off your senses, and being aware of consciousness. The sensory awareness of consciousness, which is what we're talking about, is one of the 6 senses that are active when you're alive, right? And it's quite coarse. It's like physical matter. In terms of coarseness, we could say it's subtler than physical matter, but it's still quite coarse. Way down below that is a very, very subtle form of consciousness called clear light that normally only appears at the time of death. You normally only have a direct experience of it when you're going through the process of dying. Now, If you do training in Tibetan Tantra, for example, you do training every day to make sure that at the time of death you can recognize this state of mind and use it for spiritual practice. If you do those practices well, you can actually generate the right conditions inside the body and the mind to have a direct experience of clear light consciousness in this lifetime. If you do that, then you can rest in that clear light awareness in the same way that here on level 2, we were resting in the more coarse type of awareness with the 5 senses turned off, right? So this more coarse type of awareness is just your consciousness at the level of, basically at the level of the 6 senses, right? Which is still very, very subtle, very profound, but even more subtle, even more profound is clear light awareness, which is this sort of the most subtle type of awareness. So that type of just sitting practice, which we would call Mahamudra practice or Dzogchen practice, is only available if you have either you have like 16 hours a day to do just sitting, like ordinary just sitting types of practice, or if you do other types of techniques that are available in highest yoga tantra that make it available, or in my humble opinion, if you do certain types of Taoist Neidan practices that are almost identical in some cases, not all. There are schools of Neidan that are not identical, but there are some that seem to be identical with the Tibetan tantric approaches. And these approaches, therefore, through various methods that I can't really discuss in public, give you the ability to access clear light. And the reason, by the way, that some of these techniques in both Taoism and Buddhism are kept secret is not because they're weird or they're sexual or whatever. The reason they're kept secret is because quite often they have to do with, to put it in modern terms, sort of rearranging your nervous system. And that can go just about as wrong as you might imagine, you know? Like if you're rearranging your nervous system and you don't know what you're doing, man, you're going to have a bad day. And so, yeah, these systems, they can hurt you. They can mess you up big time. And that's why they're secret, not because, you know, Buddhists are trying to gatekeep people and keep them out or whatever. It's to stop people from getting hurt. Also, the initial stages of these techniques that give you actual access to clear light, they actually make every part of your personality stronger. So in terms of both systems, if you look at highest yoga tantra, for example, in the generation stage, that first stage of practice, which can be quite long, can be decades long, is meant to help carve your character and improve the surface level of your personality, basically, so that when you, as one of my teachers said, when you plug in the Christmas tree is decorated with all this nice stuff, right? I mean, if you plug in the Christmas tree and it's covered in gremlins and it's covered in, you know, blood and guts and whatever, it's going to be pretty bad. So you don't want to be putting a whole bunch of power and juice into something that's like horrifically bad. So that's why these are secret, not because they're filled with weird stuff that is embarrassing or something, but because they can be misinterpreted on the one hand and they can harm you on the other. And so therefore, they're kept secret so that you don't supercharge your terrible personality and make yourself worse, or you don't fry your nervous system, or you don't take the aspects of this that can be misinterpreted and turn them into really strange things. And all of those things have happened, by the way, and in some cases have happened to quite capable people. So this isn't just something that happens to beginners. It's something that can happen to people that have been at this for a very, very long time. To bring it back to today's discussion, however, level 3 of a just sitting style practice is you gain access to the very subtlest type of consciousness, and you rest in that state of consciousness. Okay? So the 3 levels, which I think will make sense, and maybe make sense out of why I've put them in this order. The first level is all 6 senses are active, including the 5 external ones. And you are simply fully aware of what's occurring in all 6 fields of awareness. The next level down is you turn off the 5 external senses by focusing completely on consciousness. You find a gap between thoughts. Over a number of months, you make that gap bigger by simply resting the awareness and becoming increasingly aware of when those gaps are present. Then you make the mind more and more calm. Maybe you do some retreat. The gap gets bigger, and eventually you gain an experience of pure consciousness without the 5 senses turned on. And remember, consciousness has no color, no shape, no particular location in space, and it's formless. It doesn't have, I said that, it has no shape. It's formless. So consciousness is very different than having an experience of pure consciousness is very different than having an experience of the 5 external senses and consciousness at the same time. And it's much subtler. And then below that, here's ordinary consciousness, right? Ordinary pure consciousness, let's say, at the level of the 6 senses. Down here below this is the subtlest form of consciousness called clear light. When you can gain access to clear light and rest the mind in clear light, that is yet another level of basically a just sitting style practice where you rest in what the mind actually is. And I'm stripping away a lot of the sort of religious language and mystical language to hopefully make it more accessible to you. But these 3 practices, if we were speaking in religious terms, are maybe the holiest, most incredible, most profound religious kinds of experiences that exist. Okay? If you can do these things, my goodness, this is the essence really of all spiritual practice. If you gain access to these things, it will dramatically change your personality. And as a support for this practice, we're going to talk about Foundation 5. And in the same way, I talked about very briefly level 3 and said, well, if you do these practices, it can superpower it can make all of your negative qualities even stronger, because you're just adding more power, more juice, more raw capability to a body, to a system, to a set of emotions that are chaotic. Rumination meditation, which I'm basically combining with Vipassana. I'll talk about Vipassana as a type of rumination meditation, which is a slight change in the way of framing things, but in terms of practical experientially, that's, at least from my point of view, that's how it feels. So rumination meditation is how you decorate the Christmas tree really nicely before you plug it in. Rumination meditation is how you take all of this stuff occurring on the surface of the mind and you transform it into nicer stuff. You take all the gremlins and the goblins and the guts and the gore off of the tree, and you put all the nice decorations and the little angels and the, right? You make it all pretty. And I can tell you, again, from personal experience, if inside you, if your inner workshop that you're doing all the work in is a nicer place to be in, you'll want to spend more time in there. if your inner workshop is ugly and filled with bad smells, and there's constantly some like annoying guy playing a song on repeat in there, and somebody like on a movie screen in the corners, like a gag reel of every terrible, stupid thing you've ever done. Like you don't want to spend a lot of time in the workshop. You don't want to go inside your mind if it's filled with chaos and pain and So rumination meditation helps you address all of this stuff that's on the surface of your mind. So that the surface of your mind, instead of being like this, is more like this, right? And more and more and more of what occurs naturally on the surface of the mind is nice and pleasant and worth experiencing. So when you can do that, when you can, let me bring myself back here. So when you can do that, when all of this stuff on the surface of your mind is a little more nice and, more loving, more caring, more patient, more perseverance to get stuff done, more joy. When this is what the surface of the mind is like, then there's more energy to do all of this internal work that you're trying to do that's a little more difficult. And because it's nicer inside the workshop, you want to be inside the workshop. So it improves the quality of your life in a very practical sense. And it helps you work through all the nonsense. And it helps you work through whatever your major problem is. If you're angry, if you're like really obsessed with sex, if you're, I don't know, really attached to all the little baubles and lights and so forth of life, and you spend most of your time just chasing the next little thing that you want, or I don't know. Everybody has their own specific blend of negative emotions and negative mental states. So the techniques we're going to go over in rumination meditation and eventually culminating in Vipassana will help you address that. And through this sort of rumination to meditation process to Vipassana meditation process, through understanding this, you're also going to come to understand something about, for example, what it means to train in Buddhist selflessness, the teachings of not self, the teachings of selflessness, the teachings of emptiness, that sort of thing. So those come through rumination. Also through rumination comes things like universal love, universal compassion, a universal feeling of equality and equanimity, a universal feeling of generosity, a universal feeling of patience and perseverance, much ethics that are much more stable, these sorts of things. So I would say much of that, perhaps depending on how we drew lines and boundaries around everything, maybe even all of that comes through rumination meditation. Learning how to think through things is incredibly important. And then learning how to think through things while adding direct non-conceptual observation from all of these previous exercises we've been doing. Very important. And then whatever the conclusion is, being able to hold that conclusion with concentration. Now we're talking about Vipassana. Being able to use reason, observation, analysis, and then hold it with concentration. That final part where you can hold, where you can take each piece that you've analyzed with concentration, and then finally hold the conclusion with concentration. Now we're doing Vipassana, right? We're doing that analytic meditation. So without further ado, I must wrap it up. Can I say that? What do I normally say? Oh, I think I normally say, thank you so much for coming. Hope to see you again very soon. Bye-bye.